The universe in Garrett
I
Voss's
never want to leave
professional
this
opinion
moment.
was nothing more
Nor
than
I, my
poorly
love.
maintained hardware.
I
It
never
was
want to leave
vast
this
and different
moment.
and prone to
Nor I, my
catastrophic
love.
failure
Stay
at the
with
most
me.
inconvenient times possible. As a Level 4 systems engineer aboard the Meridian station, his entire existence had become dedicated to proving that singular fact. The station itself was a monument to corporate ambition and structural compromise. A massive rotating torus of oxidized titanium and flickering industrial lights, it hung in geosynchronous orbit above the swirling cobalt storms of Kepler 442. The official designation called it a mining platform. The workers called it the rust gut. And somewhere between those two descriptions lay the truth that Garrett had come to accept over 6 years of 12-hour shifts and recycled air. He was currently shoulder-deep inside the primary atmospheric scrubber of Section C, a place the maintenance crews had unofficially named the Iron Tomb. The air here tasted like metal shavings in desperation. The temperature hovered at exactly 94 degrees, and the machine he was fighting had been manufactured before his grandfather was born. "Come on, you temperamental piece of scrap," Garrett muttered, his voice echoing dully inside the ventilation shaft. "Give me a green light or I'm letting the carbon dioxide turn everyone in the mess hall into very quiet statues." The scrubber responded with a grinding noise that sounded like arthritis in a dying whale. Garrett wiped sweat from his forehead with the back of his grease-stained hand, leaving a dark smear across his pale skin. His fingers found the neural port behind his right ear, an old habit born from years of instinct. The port sat cold and dead against his skull. A reminder, a scar that never healed. While everyone else on Meridian Station lived inside the constant hum of the neural mesh, sharing thoughts and emotions and the mundane details of their breakfast choices, Garrett existed in perfect silence. His brain, through some quirk of biology or a cosmic joke, simply refused to connect. The medical board had labeled him a static carrier. His ex-girlfriend had called him empty. His coworkers just called him the flatliner and left it at that. To Garrett, it meant he was the only person on a station of 3,000 souls who didn't have to listen to everyone else's opinions about the quality of the synthetic coffee. He finished tightening the last valve, crawled backward out of the shaft, and checked his wrist chronometer. 1,800 hours. The station's artificial lighting was beginning its slow transition toward night cycle, bathing the industrial corridors in shades of amber and rust. But today the usual rhythmic pulse of the ore crushers carried a different frequency. Something higher, tighter, nervous. The Vesperi were arriving. Garrett had read the briefings. Everyone had. The Vesperi were the kind of species that ended up in high-budget science documentaries and diplomatic training modules. Ancient, elegant, terrifyingly beautiful. They came from somewhere deep in the Veil Nebula, a region of space that human sensors could barely penetrate and human ships rarely visited. Their skin was translucent, their eyes were pools of liquid silver, and their primary method of communication involved a form of empathy so profound it made the neural mesh look like two tin cans connected by string. To a Vesperi, every human on Meridian Station was screaming. Every secret shame, every hidden desire, every flicker of anger or lust or fear was broadcast directly into their consciousness without filter or mercy. They didn't just see you, they felt you, completely. Garrett's comm unit crackled to life, interrupting his thoughts. "Voss." Chief Davidson's voice carried the particular brand of irritation reserved for subordinates who had committed the crime of existing. "Get your scruffy self to the primary docking ring. All hands on deck for the Sovereign's arrival. And for the love of whatever god you pretend to believe in, put on a clean uniform." Garrett looked down at his jumpsuit. It was currently 3 distinct shades of industrial grime and bore the permanent scars of 6 years' worth of emergency repairs. Clean was a relative concept. "I'm a systems engineer, Chief," Garrett replied, wiping his hands on a rag that was somehow dirtier than his hands had been. "I fix pipes. The aliens don't need to see my ugly face." "Xenocultural protocols, Voss. Move it. If the Sovereign sees one person not standing at attention, Titan Energy loses the mining rights to the entire nebula. And if that happens, I'm personally spacing you without a suit." Threats of explosive decompression were a standard greeting on Meridian. Garrett sighed, packed his toolkit, and headed toward the main concourse. The ceremony was exactly as painful as he had anticipated. Half the station's population stood in their stiffest corporate uniforms, arranged in precise lines like toy soldiers waiting for inspection. The air hummed with anxiety. Not the mechanical hum of failing equipment, but the psychic hum of 3,000 minds trying very hard to think appropriate thoughts while connected to the mesh. Garrett could see it in their faces, the strain, the performance, the desperate attempt to broadcast professionalism while suppressing every inappropriate impulse. He stood near the back next to the service entrance, invisible by habit and preference. And then Sovereign Seraphine entered the docking ring. Calling her beautiful would have been like calling a supernova a birthday candle. She was tall, draped in flowing robes of Vesperi shimmer silk that shifted colors with every movement, cascading from deep violet to pale ghostly blue. Her skin had the luminous quality of moonlight on water. Her eyes were vast mirrors of quicksilver that seemed to reflect not just light, but something deeper, something that lived beneath the surface of reality itself. But it was her ears that caught Garrett's attention. Long, delicately curved, tapering to elegant points that twitched with microscopic precision as though catching sounds that existed only in frequencies the human ear couldn't register. They moved constantly, cataloging, processing, overwhelmed. She walked past the rows of dignitaries with an expression of practiced regal composure. But Garrett saw what the others missed. He saw the way her fingers clenched at her sides, knuckles pale against her translucent skin. He saw the slight tremor in her jaw, the tightness around her luminous gaze. She looked like someone trying to swim through a hurricane while pretending the weather was fine. And then she passed directly in front of him. For exactly 3 seconds, her quicksilver eyes flicked toward his face. For exactly 3 seconds, the universe held its breath. Garrett felt something he had never felt before, a strange sharpening in the static that usually filled his head. Not a connection, not a voice, just a single piercing note of clarity, like the moment before lightning strikes. Seraphine gasped. It was a tiny sound, barely audible over the atmospheric fans and the nervous shuffling of feet. But Garrett heard it, a sound of shock and desperate relief, like someone breaking the surface of water after drowning. Then her handler's elegant Vesperi in silver armor ushered her forward. The moment passed. The procession continued toward the VIP quarters in the upper spires. But Garrett stood frozen, his heart performing an irregular rhythm against his ribs that felt more like Morse code than biology. Did she just look at you? Chief Davidson materialized at his elbow, his face a mask of horrified confusion. Maybe she appreciated my authentic working-class aesthetic, Garrett said, though his voice came out rougher than intended. Or maybe she realized I'm the only person here who isn't mentally composing his resume while pretending to smile. The chief's eyes narrowed, but before he could formulate a response involving workplace discipline or airlock-related violence, the ceremony concluded. The crowd dispersed. Garrett retreated to his quarters in section D47 as quickly as dignity and exhaustion would allow. His room was exactly 4 meters wide and smelled like recycled air that had been recycled one too many times. The bed felt like it had been stuffed with regret and broken promises. The single viewport showed nothing but the endless cobalt storms of the planet below, beautiful and completely indifferent to human suffering. Garrett sat on the edge of the mattress staring at his hands. 32 years old, 6 years on this station. No family except a sister on Mars who sent messages twice a year out of obligation. No friends except Jax Martinez, and that friendship consisted primarily of shared complaints about malfunctioning equipment. No romantic prospects since Lara had transferred to Jupiter Station 4 years ago, with a final message that still burned in his memory like acid. You're empty, Garrett. There's no resonance. I need someone who can echo me back. He stripped down to his undershirt, lay back on the pillow, and let the rhythmic thrum of the fusion core lull him towards something approximating sleep. The Sovereign's gasp echoed in his mind, but he pushed it away. Strange moments happened. They meant nothing. By morning, she would be negotiating mineral rights with the corporate brass, and he would be fixing the carbon filters in Section E. The universe would continue its slow mechanical decay, and Garrett Voss would continue to be exactly what he had always been. A hollow room in a very loud house, or so he thought. Somewhere in the luxury quarters of the Neon Spire, Sovereign Seraphine stood at a viewport that overlooked the station's rotating infrastructure. Her hands trembled against the transparent aluminum. Her breath came in shallow gasps. 20 days. 20 days since she had last truly slept. 20 days since the 7th House Council had sent her to this remote human station to negotiate mining access to the Veil Nebula. 20 days of carrying not just her own consciousness, but the collective emotional weight of 3,000 human minds, each one broadcasting their desires and fears and petty grievances directly into her empathic receivers. It was like standing at the bottom of an ocean, like being buried alive in a mountain of screaming voices. Every moment was torture. Every breath was an act of will. The Vesperi had evolved their empathic abilities over millions of years, learning to navigate the constant flood of emotional information the same way humans learn to filter out background noise. But there were limits, and for a sovereign, those limits came much sooner. Because a sovereign didn't just feel nearby minds. A sovereign felt everyone. Every member of their house, every subject under their protection, a vast network of consciousness that she carried like Atlas carried the world. On Vesperi Prime, there were sanctuaries, crystal meditation spires where the empathic noise could be dampened, where a sovereign could remember what it felt like to hear her own thoughts without the interference of 1,000 others. On Meridian Station, there was nothing. Nothing except the one moment during the ceremony when she had passed a human engineer with grease on his hands and emptiness in his mind. For exactly 3 seconds, the screaming had stopped. For exactly 3 seconds, she had remembered what silence felt like. Seraphine closed her eyes and focused on her empathic awareness, the sixth sense that had defined her entire existence. She could feel the station's population like pinpricks of light in a dark void. Anxiety, ambition, lust, boredom, fear. 3,000 emotional signatures, each one a distinct flavor of human consciousness. And somewhere in the lower decks, one perfect void. One quiet room. Her counselors would say it was madness. Her guards would call it a security violation. The diplomatic protocols clearly stated that sovereigns did not wander the industrial sections of human stations at 3 in the morning. But Seraphine had been following protocols her entire life. She had been the perfect vessel, the obedient daughter, the selfless leader who sacrificed every personal desire on the altar of duty. For 20 days she had been drowning, and now for the first time she had found something that felt like air. Decision crystallized in her mind. She waited until the 3rd hour of night cycle, when her guards assumed she was sleeping and the station's monitoring systems were at their most lax. She wrapped herself in a simple cloak of shimmer silk, suppressing its natural luminescence until she appeared as nothing more than a shadow. And she walked. The transition from the neon spire to the lower decks was like descending through layers of corporate hierarchy made manifest in architecture. The upper levels smelled like expensive air filters and fresh synthetic vegetation. The middle levels smelled like recycled ambition. The lower levels smelled like honest labor and machine oil. Seraphine followed the void in her mind like a compass pointing toward magnetic north. Through maintenance corridors, past sleeping crew quarters, down service ladders that her robes had never been designed to navigate. Until finally she stood outside a door marked D47, unremarkable in every way, except for the perfect silence that emanated from within. She didn't knock. The door wasn't locked. Security on Meridian relied on the neural mesh to identify intruders, and to the mesh, she was a registered diplomatic guest with clearance to move throughout the station. The sensors saw nothing unusual. The cameras recorded nothing suspicious. The room beyond was dark, small, Spartan in a way that spoke of either poverty or intentional simplicity. And on the narrow bed, the engineer slept. Seraphine stood in the doorway for a long moment, drinking in the silence like someone dying of thirst. No emotional static, no psychic pressure, just the quiet rhythm of his breathing and the distant hum of the station's mechanical heartbeat. She stepped inside. The door closed behind her with a soft hiss. And for the first time in 20 days, Sovereign Seraphine felt like she could breathe. She moved closer to the bed, drawn by a need so profound it bypassed rational thought entirely. The engineer, this Garrett Voss, according to the crew manifest she had scanned, lay on his back with one arm thrown across his face. Even in sleep, he looked tired. The kind of tired that came from years, not days. Seraphine sat carefully on the edge of the mattress. The shimmer silk of her robes made no sound. She studied his face in the dim light from the viewport, memorizing the lines around his eyes, the stubble on his jaw, the small scar above his left eyebrow. Human. Ordinary. completely unremarkable in every way except the one that mattered most. His mind was a void, a perfect, blessed void. She didn't mean to lie down. She only meant to sit for a moment to rest in the silence, to remember what it felt like to be Seraphine instead of the sovereign. But exhaustion was a tide, and she had been fighting it for 20 days. The moment her head touched the pillow next to his shoulder, sleep reached up and pulled her under like quicksand. For 6 hours, she dreamed of nothing. No visions, no empathic echoes, no voices, just darkness and peace and the steady sound of breathing that wasn't screaming. When she finally woke, the artificial dawn was beginning to creep through the viewport, painting the room in shades of amber. And she realized with a clarity that was equal parts horror and relief that she was still there, still in this stranger's bed, still wrapped in the silence like a blanket. She lifted her head slowly. Garrett Voss was awake, staring at her with eyes the color of storm clouds, not moving, barely breathing. His expression was a complicated mixture of confusion, terror, and something that might have been empathy, if empathy could exist without the neural mesh. They looked at each other for 10 seconds that felt like 10 years. "You're still here," he finally said. His voice was rough with sleep and disbelief. "It's your room," Seraphine replied. Her own voice came out steadier than she felt. "Contractually speaking, you're supposed to be here. And I haven't slept in 20 days. The truth fell out of her mouth before she could construct something more diplomatic. "Your mind is like cool water in a desert." Garrett's eyes widened slightly. He still hadn't moved. She realized his arm was partially trapped beneath her weight, but he seemed terrified to shift position. "I'm sorry," he said, and she could hear a genuine confusion in his voice. "If I'm being too quiet, I can hum something." "What are you doing here, Your Majesty? How did you even get in? Security is supposed to be better than this." Seraphine sat up slowly, tucking her legs beneath her. The shimmer silk of her robes had settled into a soft gray, the color of calm. "The doors on this station are designed to keep out physical threats. They are not designed to keep out someone who is desperate for air." Desperate for air, Garrett glanced at the atmospheric readout on his desk. "The oxygen levels are at 97%. I fixed that scrubber yesterday." "Not that kind of air." She watched understanding begin to dawn in his expression. He sat up as well, maintaining careful distance between them on the narrow bed. His hair was sticking up in several directions. There was a crease on his cheek from the pillow. He looked profoundly human in a way that made something in her chest tighten. "My people," she continued, speaking slowly as she tried to translate Vesperi concepts into human language. "We are born into a storm. We feel the echoes of every mind around us. On this station, with its hundreds of stressed, ambitious, fearful humans, it was like being buried alive in a mountain of screaming voices. I haven't slept in 20 days. I was breaking." The words hung in the air between them. Seraphine watched his face, trying to read human expressions without the benefit of empathic feedback. She saw his throat work as he swallowed, saw his hands clench and unclench against his knees. "And you found me," he said quietly, "because I'm a dud, because my head is empty." "Not empty." Seraphine reached out, then stopped herself, hand hovering in the space between them. "Quiet. Your mind is like a deep well of cool water in the middle of a desert. When I stood near your quarters last night, the screaming stopped. For the first time in 20 days, I could hear my own thoughts." She lowered her hand back to her lap, fingers twisting in the fabric of her robes. "I didn't mean to come inside. I only meant to stand by the door for a moment. But then you passed out in my bed," Garrett finished, and there was the faintest hint of something that might have been humor beneath the shock. "I slept," Seraphine said, and her voice filled with a wonder that she couldn't quite suppress. "For 6 hours. No dreams, no echoes, just peace." They sat in silence for a long moment. Outside the viewport, the cobalt storms of Kepler 442 flickered with distant lightning. Inside the room, two people who should never have met tried to process the impossible situation they had created. Finally, Garrett ran a hand through his messy hair and let out a long breath. "Look, I'm glad my defective brain is apparently a luxury spa for empathic royalty, but we are in a massive amount of trouble. If the chief or your guards find you here, they're not going to ask about your sleep quality. They're going to assume I've committed some kind of intergalactic felony." Seraphine looked at him. really looked at him. Not with her empathic senses, which showed her only blessed silence, but with her eyes. She saw the grease stains on his undershirt, the calloused hands that spoke of years working with tools, the wariness in his expression that came from being dismissed and underestimated his entire life. She saw someone who understood what it meant to be alone in a crowd. "Then we shall have to be very careful," she said. Garrett stared at her. "Are you suggesting what I think you're suggesting?" Seraphine met his gaze without flinching. "I am a sovereign, and I am tired. I will return to my duties now. The negotiations, the ceremonies, all of it." She paused, and when she spoke again, her voice carried the steel that had been bred into her bloodline for 1,000 generations. "But tonight, when the station grows dark, I will come back to the silence." She stood, the shimmer silk flowing around her like liquid moonlight. She crossed to where he still sat on the bed and did something that no sovereign had ever done with a human. She reached out and pressed her palm against his cheek. Her skin was cool, but where she touched him, Garrett felt a strange tingling warmth. Not empathic connection, something more fundamental, something more honest. "Don't lock your door, Garrett Voss," she whispered. And then she was gone, slipping out into the corridor with a grace that made the moment feel like a dream. The door hissed shut behind her, and Garrett was alone again in the silence. But for the first time in his life, the silence didn't feel like a curse. It felt like the most valuable thing he possessed. He sat there for a long time, staring at the empty space where a goddess had just been sleeping. The scent of her presence, something like night-blooming jasmine and ozone, was already fading into the recycled air. In 40 minutes, he had a shift that would require him to crawl through the tertiary coolant systems. In 6 hours, he had a mandatory safety briefing. In 2 weeks, the Vesperi delegation would leave, and his life would return to exactly what it had been, except now he knew something he hadn't known before. He knew that his emptiness, the thing that had cost him love and connection, and every chance at belonging, had value to someone, not despite what he was, because of it. Garrett started to get dressed, and realized his hands were shaking. Somewhere in the upper spires of Meridian Station, Sovereign Seraphine attended her morning briefings with the composed grace expected of her station. She listened to mineral rights discussions and trade route proposals with appropriate attention. She smiled at the appropriate moments. She projected the image of a sovereign in perfect control, and inside her mind, for the first time in 20 days, there was quiet enough to hear herself think. The silence, she realized, was not an absence. It was a gift, and tonight she would claim it again. The second night, Seraphine returned exactly as promised. Garrett had spent the day in the engine core replacing coolant seals that had been leaking since before he was born. His hands were raw, his shoulders ached, and his mind kept circling back to the impossible memory of waking up with a Vesperi sovereign sleeping on his chest. By the time night cycle arrived, he had almost convinced himself it had been a fever dream brought on by atmospheric toxins. Then the door opened at midnight, and she stepped inside like moonlight taking physical form. They didn't speak immediately. Seraphine settled onto the edge of his bed with the cautious grace of someone approaching a wild animal. Garrett sat in his desk chair, maintaining distance, trying to remember how normal human beings were supposed to act when royalty invaded their quarters. "Tell me about Earth," she said finally, her voice soft in the dimness. So he did. Garrett told her about the Pacific Ocean, about standing on the cliffs near his childhood home in Montana and watching waves that had traveled 3,000 miles just to break against ancient stone. He told her about real coffee, the kind that came from plants instead of recycling systems, and how it tasted like morning and possibility. He told her about silence that came from space instead of emptiness, about forests where the only sound was wind and branches that had been growing since before humans reached the stars. And Seraphine listened with an intensity that made him understand she wasn't just hearing words. In the quiet of his mind, she could visualize everything he described without the constant interference of other people's emotions. For her, his stories weren't just narratives. They were sanctuaries. "On my world," she said when he finished, "we have crystal spires that sing when the twin moons reach zenith. We have oceans that glow with bioluminescent life. We have gardens where the flowers bloom in colors your eyes cannot process." She paused, her mirror-like eyes reflecting the distant lightning of the planet below. "But we have no silence. We are never alone with our thoughts. From birth to death, we swim in an ocean of other minds." "That sounds exhausting," Garrett said. "It is. her hands twisted in her lap, fingers interlacing and separating in a pattern that spoke of deep anxiety. For a sovereign, it is worse. I became the vessel for the seventh house when I was 18 years old. My parents died in a stellar accident. I inherited not just their throne, but their burden. Every joy, every grief, every petty complaint of millions of minds, flowing through me like I'm nothing more than a transmission relay. Garrett leaned forward, elbows on his knees. What does Seraphine feel like without all the noise? She looked at him for a long moment, and something in her expression cracked. I don't remember anymore. The silence stretched between them, heavy with shared understanding. Finally, Seraphine spoke again, her voice carrying a hesitant hope. Would you tell me a story, not about Earth, not about real places, a story from your imagination? Garrett felt self-conscious in a way he hadn't felt since childhood. I'm not a storyteller, Your Majesty. I fix broken equipment. I don't write fiction. Then tell me one you remember, Seraphine said, shifting closer on the bed, still maintaining careful space between them. Please, in the quiet, I can hold thoughts that are only mine. I can visualize without interference. Stories give me boundaries. A place to rest my mind. So Garrett told her about the engineer who fixed a broken star. It was a story he'd read 20 years ago in a battered paperback novel he'd found in a secondhand shop on Mars Colony. Probably poorly remembered, embellished by time and his own experiences. He told it simply without flourish, the same way he'd explain a repair procedure to a junior technician. It was about a maintenance worker on a deep space observatory who discovered that a dying red giant wasn't actually a natural stellar phenomenon. It was a machine vast beyond comprehension, built by a civilization so ancient their name had been forgotten before Earth's sun ignited. The star machine had been running for billions of years, providing light and heat to countless worlds, but now its core mechanisms were failing. Every scientist, every expert said it couldn't be fixed. The technology was too advanced, too alien, too far beyond human understanding. But the engineer, whose name was something simple and forgettable, looked at the impossible complexity and saw what everyone else had missed underneath all the exotic physics and quantum mysteries. It was still just a machine, and machines, no matter how grand, followed the same basic principles. They had inputs and outputs, stress points and failure modes, components that wore down and needed replacement. So the engineer went into the heart of the dying star with nothing but a toolkit and enough stubborn refusal to accept defeat. She bypassed the exotic systems everyone else had been trying to understand and found the simple mechanical failure buried beneath layers of sophistication. A seal, a valve, something so basic that the ancient builders had never imagined it would fail. She fixed it with a wrench and a replacement part she machined herself from asteroid metal. And the star burned bright again, not because of genius or destiny, but because someone had cared enough to look past the impossible and see the practical solution underneath. When Garrett finished, he looked up and found Seraphine's face wet with tears. They tracked down her luminous cheeks in the dim light, catching reflections like falling stars. But she was smiling. Not the diplomatic mask she wore in public, but something genuine and vulnerable and utterly beautiful. Thank you, she whispered. In the silence of your mind, I could see her. The engineer. I could see the star machine, vast and ancient and dying. I could hold the entire story in my consciousness without it being drowned by others' emotions. For the first time in 10 years, I remembered what it feels like to imagine something that is entirely my own. Garrett did something then that surprised both of them. He reached out and took her hand. Her skin was cool and impossibly soft, like touching water given form. She looked down at their joined fingers with an expression of wonder. You're not just a vessel, he said quietly. You're a person. You shouldn't have to disappear into everyone else's noise. It is the price of my crown. Her fingers tightened around his. My people need a center. Without a sovereign, the resonance would become cacophony. We would tear ourselves apart. So you sacrifice your peace so they can have theirs. Yes. That's a terrible trade. Seraphine smiled, and it was the saddest thing Garrett had ever seen. It is the only trade I have ever known. Until now. They sat like that for a long while, hands joined, watching the storms of Kepler 442 paint the viewport in shades of emerald and cobalt. Eventually, Seraphine asked him to tell her about his life on Meridian. About the work he did, the friends he'd lost, the isolation that had defined his existence. He told her about Lyra, about the woman he'd thought he loved, who had looked at his neural silence and seen only emptiness. About the moment in the observation dome when she'd tried to sync with him and found nothing to connect to. She wanted to fix you, Seraphine observed. She wanted me to be something I'm not. And Seraphine's voice was very quiet. Am I any different? Using your silence for my own needs. Garrett considered this carefully. You're not trying to change me. You're not treating my quiet like it's broken. You're just grateful for it. That's different. Is it enough? The question came out small, uncertain. To just be grateful. For now, Garrett said, it's everything. When she finally left that night, slipping out into the pre-dawn darkness, Garrett sat alone with the lingering scent of jasmine and the warmth of her hand still ghosting across his palm. He had work in 3 hours. Meetings, repairs, the endless grinding machinery of station life. But something had shifted. The silence in his quarters no longer felt like a prison. It felt like a sanctuary that he'd been building his whole life without knowing what it was for. The third night brought a different kind of story. Seraphine arrived earlier this time, just after the beginning of night cycle. She looked more exhausted than before. The negotiations had been brutal, she explained. Hours of empathic diplomacy, where every corporate executive's greed and anxiety had hammered against her consciousness like physical blows. I need the quiet, she said simply, settling beside him on the bed, with a familiarity that spoke of their growing comfort. And I need your stories. They give me a place to rest my mind. Garrett had been thinking about this all day, about what stories meant to her, about how narrative could create boundaries in a mind that had never known walls. He told her about the captain who heard the universe's heartbeat. It was an old tale half remembered from a paperback he'd read as a teenager during the long voyage from Earth to Mars colony. A ship captain who discovered that stars weren't just balls of fusion and gravity, but living organisms with slow, vast thoughts that played out over millennia. Their consciousness was so large, so fundamentally different from human awareness, that it had been mistaken for natural physics. The captain, a woman named something like Sterling or Starling Garrett, couldn't quite remember, learned to listen to their rhythms, to navigate not by charts and calculations, but by the pulse of cosmic consciousness. Each star sang its own song. Each had a unique pattern of thought. And in the spaces between stars and the vast dark where nothing seemed to exist, there was actually the loudest song of all. The song of the universe itself, thinking thoughts too large for planets to comprehend. The captain learned to sail these currents of stellar thought. But the learning came at a price. To hear the stars, she had to learn to distinguish them from each other, to hold each individual cosmic voice separate in her mind instead of being overwhelmed by the chorus. She had to create boundaries in her consciousness spaces where she could say, this is me, this is that star, and here is where one ends and the other begins. It took her years, decades. She spent so much time learning to hear individual voices that she forgot how to hear crowds. When she finally returned to human space, she couldn't tolerate cities anymore. Couldn't stand the undifferentiated noise of millions of minds all pressed together. She could only be comfortable in small groups with people whose thoughts she could hear individually distinctly, like separate notes instead of overwhelming static. In the end, she chose to return to space. Not because she hated humanity, but because she had learned something they hadn't. That connection without boundaries wasn't connection at all. It was drowning. The captain was alone with the stars, Seraphine said, when he finished, her voice filled with wonder. Billions of minds around her, vast and ancient and incomprehensible. But she found the space to hear them individually instead of as noise. That's how I've always read it, Garrett said. Seraphine was quiet for a long time. Her hand had found his at some point during the story, and now she held it like an anchor. Teach me that, she finally whispered. Teach me to hear individual voices instead of the scream. To create boundaries in my mind the way the captain did, through stories, through having thoughts that are only mine. I don't know if I can teach that, Garrett admitted. I've spent my whole life with nothing but boundaries. I don't know how to build them. I only know how to live inside them. Then show me how you live. Her luminous stare held his with desperate intensity. Every night tell me a story. Let me practice holding narratives in the silence. Let me learn what it feels like to have a thought that isn't shared with millions of others. And when you leave, the question hurt to ask, but it needed to be asked. When the delegation returns to Viora's Prime in 2 weeks, Seraphine's robes rippled through several colors, emotions she couldn't quite control flickering across the shimmer silk. Then I will go back to the noise, she said quietly, back to being the vessel. But I will carry these nights with me. The memory of silence, the knowledge that it exists. Perhaps that will be enough to survive. That's not fair to you. Nothing about my life has ever been fair, Garrett Voss. But she smiled as she said it, a small fragile thing. But these moments with you are the first unfair thing that has been weighted in my favor. They talked late into the night. About her childhood on Viora's Prime, about growing up knowing that every thought she had was shared with tutors and counselors and eventually the entire seventh house. About the moment her parents died and the crown settled onto her shoulders like a physical weight that had been crushing her ever since. Garrett shared his own loneliness. About growing up on Earth, knowing he was defective, that his brain didn't work the way it was supposed to. About watching everyone else connect effortlessly while he sat in silence, invisible and forgotten. We are both alone, Seraphine observed, but in opposite ways. You cannot connect, I cannot disconnect. Maybe that's why this works, Garrett said. You need someone who can't feel your thoughts. I need someone who doesn't expect me to share mine. A perfect dysfunction, Seraphine said with a soft laugh. Two broken pieces that somehow fit together. When she left that night, the sky beyond the viewport was just beginning to lighten toward dawn. She paused at the door, looking back at him. Tomorrow night, she said, tell me one more story, the best one you know. I want to hold something beautiful in my mind before I have to let the noise back in. I'll find you something beautiful, Garrett promised. The fourth night he told her about the last lighthouse at Galaxy's Edge. It was a story he'd almost forgotten, buried in the back of his memory from childhood. His mother had read it to him once when he was young enough to still believe in heroes and happy endings. He'd thought about it all day while repairing the atmospheric processors, trying to remember the details to make it perfect for her. The story was about a lighthouse keeper stationed at the absolute edge of explored space, where the known universe ended and the infinite void began. Her lighthouse was the last reference point for ships venturing into darkness, a beacon that said, you are not alone and there is a way home. But the lighthouse keeper herself was profoundly alone. The station was automated, built to run for centuries without maintenance. Supply ships came once every 5 years. Communication with the rest of humanity traveled at light speed, making conversation impossible. Questions took months to send, years to receive answers. By the time a reply arrived, the question had usually been forgotten. The keeper had volunteered for this posting after losing her family to a plague on the colony worlds. She wanted distance from humanity, space to grieve. She thought isolation would heal her. At first it nearly destroyed her. The silence was so complete it felt like suffocation. She would talk to herself just to hear a voice. She kept holographic recordings of her family playing on loop, desperately trying to fill the void with echoes of the past. But slowly over years, something changed. She stopped fighting the silence and started listening to it. She began keeping a journal, not for anyone else to read, but to have conversations with herself, to track her own thoughts, her own growth, her own healing. She learned that solitude and loneliness weren't the same thing, that being alone meant she could finally hear her own voice without it being drowned out by others. She started writing letters to herself, letters from past her to future her, creating a conversation across time with the only person who would always be there, herself. She documented her thoughts, her fears, her small victories over isolation. She created art from the stellar phenomena she observed. She composed music that no one else would ever hear, simply because creating it gave her joy. By the time her 5-year tour was supposed to end, she had become her own best companion. When the supply ship arrived to relieve her, she chose to stay. Not because she hated humanity, but because she had finally learned to love herself, to be comfortable in her own presence, to understand that the silence wasn't emptiness, it was the space where she could finally exist without apologizing for taking up room. The lighthouse still burned, guiding ships through the dark, but now it was maintained by someone who understood that providing light for others didn't mean burning yourself out, that you could be a beacon and a whole person at the same time. When Garrett finished, he found Seraphine staring at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. Her robes had settled into a deep contemplative blue. "The Keeper learned to be alone without being lonely," Seraphine said slowly. "She learned to have conversations with herself, to remember that her thoughts mattered even when no one else could hear them." "That's how I've always understood it," Garrett said. "Is that what you've been doing?" Her hand found his in the darkness. "For 32 years, learning to be your own companion." "Trying to," Garrett admitted. "Not always succeeding. Most of the time, honestly, I've just been lonely. Telling myself the silence was fine when really it hurt like hell." "Then we'll learn together," Seraphine whispered, her voice fierce with determination. "You'll teach me to be alone without being lonely, to create boundaries in my consciousness, to hold thoughts that are only mine. And maybe," she paused, vulnerability flickering across her face, "maybe I'll teach you that silence can be shared, that being quiet together is different from being quiet alone." They sat like that for a long time, hands joined the silence between them, no longer empty, but full of possibilities. Eventually, Seraphine leaned her head against his shoulder, and Garrett carefully, cautiously put his arm around her. It wasn't romantic exactly, it was something deeper. Two people who had spent their lives being alone in opposite ways, discovering that maybe, just maybe, they didn't have to carry that loneliness anymore. "Thank you," Seraphine murmured, "for the stories, for the silence, for seeing me instead of just the crown. Thank you for making my emptiness feel like something valuable instead of something broken." She left just before dawn, as always, but this time she paused at the door and looked back with an expression that made Garrett's heart clench. "Only a few more nights," she said quietly. "Then the negotiations will conclude, and I'll return to Vioris Prime." "I know. I don't want to go." The admission hung in the air between them, raw and honest. Garrett didn't know what to say. She was a sovereign. He was a maintenance worker. Their worlds were literally incompatible. This had always been temporary, but the silence between them had stopped feeling temporary. It had started feeling like home. "Get some sleep," he finally said, because what else could he say? "You have meetings in 3 hours." She nodded and slipped out into the corridor, leaving Garrett alone with the ghost of her presence and the growing certainty that when she left, she would take something essential with her. Something he hadn't even known he possessed until she'd shown him it was there. The fourth day brought violence that neither of them could have anticipated. Garrett was pulling on his jumpsuit when the emergency klaxons started screaming. His comm unit lit up with frantic messages from Jax Martinez, the only person on the station who still bothered to check if he was alive. "Scug, stay the hell away from the central corridors. The miners are tearing Section 9 apart, and security just deployed shock battalions. It's going to get bloody." But Garrett was already moving, not towards safety, but toward the chaos, because somewhere in his gut he knew Seraphine would be there. That her empathic senses would pull her toward the crisis like gravity pulling water downhill, and she would need him. The riot had started in the mining quarters, where workers had been suffering under rerouted power and thinning air, while corporate executives ensured the vast Barry delegation enjoyed perfect atmospheric conditions. 4 days of mounting rage amplified through the neural mesh, feeding back on itself until individual anger became collective fury. The main concourse of Section 9 looked like a war zone when Garrett arrived. 20 miners, their faces twisted with neural exhaustion and amplified rage, faced off against a line of security personnel whose shock prods crackled with blue electricity. But the weapons were irrelevant. The real battle was happening in the mesh, where anger fed on anger, fear reflected fear, creating a feedback loop that was driving everyone toward violence they didn't truly want. Above it all, on an observation platform, Garrett saw her. Seraphine stood, frozen hands pressed against the transparent aluminum barrier, her entire body trembling. Her robes flickered through colors so rapidly they became a strobe effect, and red, orange, purple, black, cycling faster than thought. She was feeling everything. The miners' rage, the guards' terror, the station's collective panic, all of it pouring into her empathic receivers without filter or mercy. She was dying. Right there in full view of everyone, she was being torn apart by the emotional storm. Garrett didn't think. He ran. He shoved through the crowd of onlookers, ignored the security cordon, and stepped directly into the space between the miners and the guards, into the eye of the empathic hurricane. "Get back!" a guard named Henderson yelled, shock prod raised. "Civilian, this is a restricted zone." But Garrett wasn't looking at the guards. He was looking at the lead miner, a grizzled veteran named Silas Murphy, who had worked the ore crushers for 40 years and whose hands shook with the accumulated fury of 300 connected mines. "Silas," Garrett said quietly, his voice somehow cutting through the chaos. "Look at me." The miner's bloodshot eyes focused with difficulty. His mind was drowning in the collective anger, barely able to process individual input. "Look at me, Silas. I'm a flatliner. You know me. No resonance, no echo, no noise." Garrett reached out and put his hand on the man's shoulder. The effect was immediate and profound, like dropping ice into boiling water or opening a pressure valve on an overheating reactor. The rage that had been cycling through the mesh, amplifying with each iteration, suddenly had nowhere to go. It hit Garrett's neural silence and simply stopped. In a 10-meter radius around him, minds went quiet. Silas Murphy blinked, gasped, took his first clear breath in hours. The miners near him did the same, stumbling as the feedback loop released them. The guards lowered their weapons, confused but grateful as the psychic pressure evaporated. Henderson stared at Garrett with an expression caught between wonder and fear. "What the hell are you, Voss?" "I'm an engineer," Garrett said, not taking his hand off Silas's shoulder. "And I'm telling you that if you don't give these men 5 minutes of silence, this station is going to rip itself apart." But he wasn't thinking about the miners or the guards. He was thinking about Seraphine, still frozen on the observation platform, still drowning in the empathic overload. He looked up and met her quicksilver gaze. Even from this distance, he could see the awareness returning to her eyes. The colors of her robes slowing their frantic cycling. The trembling in her body easing as his presence dampened the emotional hurricane. Their eyes locked across the chaotic space. And in that moment, Garrett understood two things with perfect clarity. First, his neural silence wasn't passive, it was active. A force that could interrupt empathic resonance, create boundaries where none existed. He was, as the medical files had labeled him, a tactical anomaly. Second, everyone had just seen it happen. Somewhere in the administrative levels of Meridian Station, security footage was being analyzed. Medical officers were reviewing neural activity graphs, and corporate executives were realizing they had a resource they hadn't known existed. Garrett carefully removed his hand from Silas's shoulder. The quiet held. The miners released from the feedback loop looked dazed but rational. Security stood down, sensing the crisis had passed. He turned and ran for the observation platform. Seraphine had collapsed to her knees, arms wrapped around herself, rocking slightly. Up close, Garrett could see that her mirror-like eyes had gone completely white, overwhelmed by sensory inputs she couldn't process. Her breathing came in ragged gasps that sounded like drowning. He sat down beside her and very carefully, very gently wrapped his arms around her shoulders. The trembling stopped. The color in her robes settled to a steady, soft blue. Her breathing, which had been coming in desperate hitches, evened out. She turned into his chest and held on like he was the only solid thing in a universe of chaos. "I've got you," Garrett whispered into her hair, not caring who might see them. "I've got you. You're safe." They stayed like that while security restored order below, while the miners were peacefully escorted to medical evaluation, while the crisis that should have ended in bloodshed dissolved into exhausted relief. And somewhere in the administrative levels, investigator Owen Thorne watched the security footage and made a decision that would change everything. The summons came the next morning, delivered with the kind of bureaucratic efficiency that made resistance seem futile. Garrett sat in Chief Davison's office, still wearing his grease-stained jumpsuit, while a man in an expensive black suit studied him like he was a particularly interesting specimen under a microscope. "Garrett Voss." Investigator Owen Thorne's voice was smooth, educated, completely devoid of warmth. "Level 4 systems engineer, neural carrier status, no disciplinary record, unremarkable in every possible way, except for one very interesting detail." Thorne tapped his tablet and a holographic display bloomed in the air between them. Security footage from the riot, enhanced, analyzed, annotated with neural activity graphs that looked like medical scans of a miracle. "You created a localized dampening field." Thorne continued, his gray eyes never leaving Garrett's face. 10 meters of absolute neural silence. "You interrupted an empathic feedback loop that our best psychologists said was impossible to stop without sedation." He leaned forward. How long have you been able to do this? I didn't know I could, Garrett said honestly. I just put my hand on Silas's shoulder. I was trying to help. Trying to help. Thorne's smile didn't reach his eyes. Titan Energy spends billions every year on neural stability protocols. Riots cost us money, Voss. Equipment damage, medical expenses, lost productivity, and you stopped one by existing in proximity to it. He stood pacing the small office with the restless energy of a predator sizing up prey. We have neuroscientists who would kill to understand how your brain creates that effect. We have security divisions that would pay fortunes for the ability to pacify crowds without violence. Thorne stopped directly in front of Garrett's chair, looking down with an expression that might have been sympathy if it wasn't so calculating. 5 years ago, my daughter was in a transit accident. Neural feedback cascade. 30 people died because their implants amplified each other's panic until their brains simply stopped. If we'd had someone like you there, someone who could have created a buffer zone, she might still be alive. The admission caught Garrett off guard. This wasn't just corporate greed. Thorne believed he was preventing tragedies. I'm sorry about your daughter, Garrett said carefully, but I'm not interested in being studied or weaponized. It's not a request. Thorne's voice went flat, the sympathy vanishing like it had never existed. Your employment contract includes a clause regarding extraordinary biological or technical contributions. We're invoking it. You will report to the medical wing for evaluation at 1800 hours. Your quarters are being monitored. Your credits are frozen until the assessment is complete. Chief Davidson wouldn't meet Garrett's eyes. The man was too busy calculating his own bonus for discovering a valuable resource. Is that all? Garrett asked, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. Don't think about running Voss. There's nowhere on this station you can hide from people who can track every neural signature except yours. Garrett left the office with his hands clenched into fists and a sick certainty settling in his gut. He had escaped Lyra's assessment of him as empty only to become something worse, in Thorne's eyes useful. In the crystal chambers of the Neon Spire, Seraphine attended the morning council session with her Vesperi advisors. They discussed mining quotas and trade agreements with the smooth efficiency of people who had been navigating diplomatic waters for centuries. And then Counselor Varan, eldest of her advisors, shifted the conversation with the casual ruthlessness of someone about to destroy a life. Sovereign, we must address the incident in Sector 9. The human Garrett Voss who intervened. Seraphine kept her face carefully neutral, though her robes rippled through a brief flash of orange before she controlled them. He prevented violence. He should be commended. He did more than that. Varen's aged features tightened with something that looked like concern, but felt like calculation. The Titan Energy Corporation has identified him as a neural anomaly. They plan to detain him for study. They believe his dampening effect can be weaponized, turned into a tool for crowd control. The blood drained from Seraphine's face. She had known this was possible. The moment she'd felt the empathic storm vanish around Garrett yesterday, she'd known others would notice. But hearing it stated so baldly made it real in a way that terror couldn't quite capture. When her voice came out steadier than she felt, this evening, he will be taken to their medical research division. Varan folded his hands, his expression carefully neutral. Sovereign, this is human internal business. We cannot interfere without causing a diplomatic incident that could jeopardize our mining rights to the entire nebula. Seraphine looked at her counselor, at the three Vesperi who had advised her since she inherited the crown at 18, at the faces that had spent 10 years teaching her that duty meant sacrifice, that sovereignty meant putting the needs of the many above the needs of the one. She thought about 10 years of being the perfect vessel, 10 years of subordinating every personal desire to the requirements of her position, 10 years of slowly forgetting what it felt like to make a choice that wasn't about politics or responsibility or the greater good. She thought about Garrett's hand on her cheek that first morning, the warmth of skin against skin, the first genuine touch she'd received in years that didn't come laden with empathic expectations. She thought about the stories, the engineer who fixed the broken star, the captain who learned to hear individual voices in the cosmic chorus, the lighthouse keeper who discovered that being alone didn't have to mean being lonely. She thought about 4 nights of finally being able to hear her own thoughts without the interference of millions of others. No, she said quietly. Varen's ears twitched in confusion. Sovereign. No. Louder this time, her voice carrying the steel that came from a bloodline that had ruled for 10,000 years. I will not abandon him to that fate. This is unwise. Counselor Mira interjected, her robes cycling through agitated purples. The political ramifications. I don't care about the political ramifications. Seraphine stood, and for the first time in 10 years, her voice carried the kind of authority that made counselors lean back in their seats. Garrett Voss saved my life. He gave me peace when I was breaking under the weight of this crown. He stepped into violence to protect me and every other soul on this station. And now he's being imprisoned for having the courage and the biology to help others. You would risk our mining agreement for one human. Varen's voice vibrated with disbelief. Seraphine looked at her reflection in the crystal walls, at the woman she had become over 10 years of sovereignty, regal, composed, slowly disappearing into her duties until there was nothing left of the person who had once had dreams and desires and a self that existed separate from her crown. It was time to choose something different. Yes, she said, and the word felt like freedom. I would risk it all. 1,600 hours found Garrett sitting on his bed, staring at the toolkit that represented his entire career. Wrenches, diagnostic tablets, calibration tools, everything he needed to fix the broken pieces of the universe. Nothing that could fix this. The door opened without warning. Seraphine stepped inside, still wearing her formal robes, but her quicksilver eyes were wide with fear, and her hands were shaking in a way he'd never seen before. They're going to arrest you, she said without preamble. I know. I can't let that happen. Garrett looked up at her, this impossible woman who had invaded his life and his quarters and somehow made him believe that being empty wasn't the same as being broken. There's nothing you can do, Your Majesty. You said it yourself in council. This is human business. Then I'm making it Vesperi business. She crossed the room and knelt in front of him, taking his hands in hers. Her skin was cool and trembling. Come with me. I'm offering you sanctuary on Vioris Prime. My transport leaves at dawn. Corporate security has no jurisdiction in the private hangar. If we move now, we can... You're asking me to defect. Garrett's voice came out rougher than intended, thick with emotions he didn't know how to process. To leave Earth's system. My sister Sarah on Mars. My parents' graves in Montana. Everything I've ever known. I'm asking you to choose freedom over imprisonment. Her grip on his hands tightened. I'm asking you to choose a world where your silence is valued, not stolen and weaponized. And if you're wrong, the question hurt to ask. What if your world is just another cage? What if your people want to study me the same way Titan Energy does? What if I'm trading one laboratory for another? Seraphine's robes rippled through several colors, orange, fear, purple, uncertainty, and finally settling on a deep, honest blue. Then it will be a cage where you're a guest, not a prisoner, where you have the protection of the seventh house, where I will fight anyone who tries to treat you as anything less than a person. She leaned forward, her luminous stare holding his with desperate intensity. I'm not asking you to save me anymore, Garrett. I'm asking, do you want to be free? Garrett thought about the lab, about Investigator Thorne's cold calculation dressed up as grief, about spending the rest of his life as a test subject, poked and prodded and studied until they figured out how to replicate what made him different, then discarded like obsolete equipment when they were done. He thought about Lyra's last message years ago, but still burning in his memory. You're empty. He thought about Seraphine's whisper 4 nights ago. You're a sanctuary. He thought about 32 years of being invisible, of being treated like defective hardware, of believing the silence in his head made him less than human. And he realized that staying on Meridian Station, staying in human space, meant accepting that assessment forever. It meant letting them define what he was, letting them use him up and throw him away. If I go, he said slowly, it could start a war. Titan Energy won't just let you take what they consider corporate property. Let them try. Her voice went cold, regal, dangerous. The voice of a sovereign who had spent 10 years being diplomatic and was done compromising. I am Sovereign Seraphine of the 7th House. I have faced empires that make this corporation look like children playing at commerce. If they want to challenge my right to offer sanctuary to a guest, They will learn that Vesperi sovereignty is not merely a diplomatic courtesy. It is a fact of the universe enforced by treaties older than their entire civilization. Garrett looked at her and saw perhaps for the first time not the desperate woman who had collapsed in his bed seeking silence. He saw a queen who would burn the world down for someone she cared about, someone who had found her strength in the quiet he'd given her and was now willing to risk everything to protect him. "My sister," he said. "I need to send her a message. Let her know I'm not dead or kidnapped, even if I can't tell her where I'm going. We can arrange that. Once we're safely away, once you have the protection of Vesperi space." Seraphine's expression softened slightly. "You won't have to sever all ties to humanity, Garrett. Just to the parts of it that want to cage you." He looked at his quarters one last time. 4 meters of recycled air and loneliness. 6 years of invisible labor. A lifetime of being told he didn't matter because he couldn't connect the way others expected. "Okay," he whispered. "I'm in." Relief flooded Seraphine's features so profoundly that she swayed slightly. Garrett caught her shoulder, steadying her. "Thank you," she breathed. "Thank you for trusting me. Thank you for seeing me as worth the risk." She stood, pulling him up with her. "Then we must move. Now. Thorne's security team will come for you at 1800 hours. We have less than 90 minutes to reach the private hangar." He grabbed his toolkit, the only possession that truly mattered, the physical representation of who he was beneath the neural silence. One last look at the viewport at the cobalt storms of Kepler 442 that he'd watched for 6 years. Then he followed a goddess into the unknown. The maintenance tunnels of Meridian Station formed a labyrinth that only engineers and maintenance crews truly understood. Seraphine led the way with Garrett close behind her, empathic senses, creating a map of the security patrols, finding gaps in their coverage, exploiting the brief windows when corridors stood empty. Behind them, alarms started screaming. "Voss!" Thorne's voice echoed through the comm system, artificial and omnipresent. "Stop! You're making this worse for yourself. We just want to understand your ability to help others like my daughter." They ran, through service crawlways barely wide enough for Garrett's shoulders, down access ladders where Seraphine's robes somehow never snagged on the industrial machinery, despite physics suggesting they should. Past sleeping crew quarters, where confused faces appeared in doorways, illuminated by emergency lighting that painted everything in shades of red. The private hangar was 3 levels up, accessible only through the executive lift system or through a service shaft that required climbing 30 meters of vertical infrastructure while security teams converged from every direction. They climbed. Garrett's hands found purchase on rungs worn smooth by decades of maintenance crews. Above him, Seraphine moved with surprising agility, her training as a sovereign, apparently including physical conditioning, that her delicate appearance belied. Below, the sound of boots on metal grew louder, echoing up the shaft like approaching thunder. The hangar level? The door. Locked, but Seraphine's credentials overrode the security protocol with a touch. They burst through into a space that looked nothing like the industrial grime of the lower decks. Here everything was polished chrome and soft atmospheric lighting, and at the center, like a sculpture carved from moonlight and diamonds, sat the Vesperi transport, the luminous reach. Guards in silver armor bowed as Seraphine approached, not questioning, merely obeying, with the efficiency of people who had been expecting this exact scenario. The boarding ramp descended with a whisper of perfectly calibrated machinery. "Sovereign," Thorne's voice behind them, breathless from running but still attempting diplomacy. "This is a mistake. You're committing an act of theft against Titan Energy Corporation. There will be legal consequences, diplomatic repercussions." Seraphine turned at the top of the ramp, and Garrett saw her transform. Saw the woman who had trembled in his arms become the sovereign who commanded millions. Her robe shifted to a deep, defiant crimson that seemed to glow with inner fire. Garrett Voss is not property, Investigator Thorne. He is a person, a guest who has requested and been granted sanctuary under Vesperi protection. Her voice carried across the hangar with crystal clarity. "If you have objections, file them through proper diplomatic channels. But know this: if you attempt to board this vessel, if you fire upon it, you will be committing an act of war not against one human, but against the entire seventh house of the Vesperi sovereignty. This will have consequences." Thorne's facade of calm was cracking, revealing the desperation underneath. "I'm counting on it." Seraphine's smile was sharp as broken glass. Perhaps your corporation will learn that people are not resources to be extracted and exploited. The ramp closed. The airlock sealed with a hiss of escaping pressure. And for the first time in 32 years, Garrett Voss left everything he had ever known behind. The interior of the luminous reach was like stepping into a different universe. No harsh fluorescent lighting, no recycled air thick with industrial residue and despair. Just soft bioluminescence emanating from walls that seemed alive and the scent of something clean and growing like a forest after rain. But there was no time to process the beauty. The ship's bridge was controlled chaos when they arrived. Three Vesperi counselors, their robes flickering with colors that spoke of barely controlled panic, turned as Seraphine entered with Garrett trailing behind. Sovereign, Counselor Varen's voice vibrated with barely controlled fury, the sound resonating in Garrett's chest like a physical force. You have committed an act that could be interpreted as hostility against the Terran coalition. You have violated every diplomatic protocol we established. You have saved an innocent man from imprisonment and exploitation. Seraphine's voice cut through the noise like a blade brooking no argument. Garrett Voss is my guest. Under Vesperi law, I have the authority to offer sanctuary to anyone I choose. Or have you forgotten that sovereignty means exactly that, the power to make choices without requiring permission from corporate entities? At what cost? Counselor Mira demanded, her robes a swirling purple vortex that made Garrett's eyes hurt to look at. The mining rights we've been negotiating for months, our trade agreements, the peace we have maintained with humanity for centuries. Before Seraphine could answer, the ship's sensor screamed a warning that made every Vesperi on the bridge flinch as though physically struck. On the holographic display that bloomed in the center of the bridge, three massive shapes materialized from warp space. Titan Energy Thresher-class destroyers, each one bristling with weapons arrays and signal jammers that looked like the teeth of some mechanical predator. Thorne's face appeared on the communication screen, but he was no longer in the civilian suit Garrett had seen him wearing in Davidson's office. Now he wore a military bridge uniform, with the silver eagle of Titan Energy's security division glowing on his collar. His expression had transformed from sympathetic investigator to military commander with frightening ease. Sovereign Seraphine. His voice was formal, devoid of the earlier attempt at diplomacy. You are in possession of Titan Energy corporate property. Return Garrett Voss to our custody immediately, and we will consider this a regrettable misunderstanding. Refuse, and we will be forced to employ the broadcast pulse to disable your vessel and retrieve him by force. Seraphine felt her blood turn to ice in her veins. The broadcast pulse is illegal under interstellar law. It's classified as a psychic weapon banned by the Terran Accords. We prefer to think of it as a compliance tool. Thorne's smile was thin and cruel, the expression of a man who had convinced himself that any action was justified if it prevented another tragedy. You have 5 minutes to comply. For what it's worth, Sovereign, I take no pleasure in this, but I won't let more people die when we have the means to prevent it. The screen went dark. Sovereign, we must surrender him. Varen's voice carried genuine terror, now his robes shifting to a sickly gray. The broadcast pulse will kill us all. It amplifies neural frequencies beyond survivable limits. For humans with basic implants, it causes temporary paralysis. For us, for beings whose entire consciousness is built on empathic resonance, it means total neural overload. Every mind on this ship will be destroyed. Garrett stepped forward, his voice cutting through the panic. He's right, Seraphine. You can't all die for me. Take me back to them. But Seraphine wasn't looking at Garrett or the counselors or the approaching destroyers that filled the display like harbingers of death. She was looking at the crystal pedestal at the center of the bridge, the organic computer that connected the ship to its Vesperi crew through channels of empathy that humans couldn't comprehend. She was thinking about the moment in Sector 9 when Garrett's presence had created a void in the empathic storm, how his silence had interrupted the feedback loop that should have ended in massacre. She was thinking about sovereignty, about power, about the difference between being a vessel that others filled with their needs and being a force that shaped the universe according to her own will. She was thinking about the stories he'd told her, about the engineer who saw past impossible complexity to find the simple mechanical solution, about the captain who learned to create boundaries in consciousness. About the lighthouse keeper who discovered strength in solitude. No, she said quietly, but the word carried absolute conviction. Sovereign, Counselor Varen, how does the broadcast pulse work? Her voice was steady, clinical, the tone of someone solving a problem rather than succumbing to panic. The old Vesperi blinked, confused by the question. It amplifies all neural activity in a given radius to catastrophic levels. It creates a feedback loop so intense that conscious thought becomes impossible, that the mind literally tears itself apart trying to process the overload. Why does this matter when... And Garrett creates neural silence, a void where empathic energy cannot propagate or amplify. Understanding began to dawn on Varen's face, followed immediately by horror so profound his robes went white. You cannot be suggesting, I am. Seraphine moved to the crystal pedestal with the decisive stride of a sovereign who had finally stopped asking permission and started taking action. Garrett, come here. He approached slowly, sensing the weight of the moment, seeing in her luminous stare a determination that both terrified and awed him. What you're contemplating, Counselor Mira said, her voice shaking with something between fear and wonder, has never been attempted in 10,000 years of Vesperi history. Merging a sovereign's consciousness with the ship's systems while simultaneously channeling a neural dampener's effect. The strain could kill you both. The feedback could shatter your minds. You could, then it will kill us both. Seraphine held out her hand to Garrett, palm up, an offering and a plea. But I will not surrender. I will not betray someone who gave me the first peace I've known in 10 years. And I will not let Titan energy turn empathy into a weapon without showing them what true power looks like when it's wielded by someone who finally knows her own strength. Garrett looked at her outstretched hand, at this woman who had risked everything for him, who was now asking him to risk everything in return, who had transformed from desperate and drowning to fierce and certain through nothing more than a few nights of stories and silence. He thought about 32 years of being called empty, of being treated like defective equipment that failed to meet specifications, of medical professionals shaking their heads and telling him he'd never be fully human without the ability to connect through the mesh. He thought about becoming something more. He took her hand. Together they placed their palms on the crystal pedestal. The universe exploded into light and sensation beyond anything language could capture. Garrett's consciousness didn't expand gradually. It detonated outward like a supernova, boundaries shattering in an instant. His mind, which had always been a small, locked room, 4 meters of silence, in a universe of noise suddenly became the size of a cathedral. Then a city, then the entire ship. He could feel the luminous reach as an extension of his own nervous system, the coolant flowing through pipes like blood through veins, the fusion core humming in what felt like the base of his spine, the hull sensors like skin detecting every particle of stellar radiation, and everywhere flickering like candles in a vast darkness, the Vesperi crew. Hundreds of minds terrified and desperate, their fear tasting like copper on a tongue he no longer possessed. Seraphine was there too, her consciousness vast and ancient and beautiful in ways his human mind struggled to comprehend. Where he was a void, an absence that absorbed everything around it, she was a vessel of infinite capacity. Where he was silence, she was the voice that could speak into that silence and be heard across galaxies. Hold steady, her thoughts whispered directly into his expanded awareness, the intimacy of it so profound it should have been terrifying. When the pulse comes, don't fight it. Don't try to block it. Open the gates. Become the ocean that swallows the storm. The broadcast pulse hit like the fist of an angry god. It was pure noise given malicious form. The screaming of 3,000 minds on Meridian Station, all the accumulated stress and anger and fear of people pushed too far for too long, amplified and weaponized and launched across space like a missile designed to destroy consciousness itself. It sought the Vesperi minds aboard the luminous reach, looking for empathic receivers to overload and annihilate. It found Garrett instead, and Garrett merged with the ship, and Seraphine, and his own infinite silence, finally understood what he truly was. What he had always been underneath the fear and shame and 32 years of believing himself broken. Not empty, not defective, but a singularity, a point of infinite depth where noise went to die and silence was reborn. He opened himself completely, became the void he had always been, magnified 1,000-fold by the ship's systems and Seraphine's power. The broadcast pulse poured into him like water into an ocean, and in the infinite silence of his consciousness, it simply dissolved. Waves crashing against a shore that could never be eroded, absorbed and transformed into nothing more than a whisper of what it had been. But Seraphine wasn't done. While Garrett absorbed the pulse, drank it down, and rendered it harmless, she used the connection between them to do something no sovereign had attempted in 1,000 years. She reached out through the ship's quantum-entangled systems, through the ancient networks that connected her to the entire seventh house, and she projected. Not empathy, not communication, not the gentle touch of understanding that Vesperi typically used. Pure, sovereign, authority. It hit the Titan destroyers like a tidal wave of will made manifest. On the bridge of the lead ship, Investigator Thorne gasped as his neural implants flooded with a presence so vast and ancient it made human consciousness seem like a candle flame held up against a star. Every crew member felt it simultaneously. The absolute certainty that they were in the presence of something that had ruled civilizations before their species learned to make fire, that had shaped the destiny of billions, that possessed the kind of power that made their weapons and their ships and their corporate authority look like children's toys. Seraphine's voice, carrying the weight of 10,000 years of Vesperi sovereignty and the collected consciousness of millions of minds, spoke directly into their thoughts, with a force that bypassed language and imprinted itself on their very neurons. Enough. The single word wasn't a suggestion or a plea. It was a command woven into the fabric of reality itself, a declaration from a being who had finally remembered that sovereignty meant the power to shape the universe according to her will, not merely to react to the choices others made for her. The broadcast pulse cut off as though it had never existed. The destroyer's engines stuttered and died, their crews too overwhelmed by the sheer magnitude of her presence to maintain even basic operational functions. Thorne collapsed in his command chair, his eyes wide and vacant, his mind struggling to comprehend that something could exist with that much innate authority, that much concentrated will. The luminous Reach's engines flared to life with a sound like crystal singing. The jump to warp space opened like a door into infinity, a tunnel of light and impossible geometry that led away from human space and towards something new. And they were gone, leaving nothing behind but 3 drifting destroyers and a corporation that had just learned a very expensive lesson about the difference between owning things and owning people. In the bridge of the Vesperi ship, the connection severed and Garrett collapsed. His consciousness, which had expanded to encompass an entire vessel and hundreds of minds in the vast silence between stars, snapped back into the fragile container of his human brain. The cathedral became a room again. The city became a single exhausted mind. He felt Seraphine catch him before the floor could, her strength nearly gone, but still enough to ease them both down to the crystalline deck. The counselors stared at them with expressions caught between awe and something very close to fear. "You did it?" Garrett whispered, his voice raw and barely audible. "You stopped them." "We did it." Seraphine's hand found his cheek, the touch gentle despite the trembling in her fingers. "Your silence and my voice. The void and the vessel. The space between stars where power exists not to destroy, but to protect." Counselor Veron knelt beside them, his ancient face transformed by something that might have been respect, or might have been the beginning of understanding that his sovereign was no longer the compliant young woman who had accepted the crown at 18. "Sovereign," he said, his voice carrying a reverence it hadn't held before. "What you just accomplished using the void to protect the light-channeling power of that magnitude through a bond with another being. This will change everything we understand about sovereignty, about empathy, about the relationship between silence and connection." But Seraphine wasn't listening to the political implications or the historical significance. She was looking at the human in her arms, the man who had given her silence and stories and the strength to finally become herself, who had then stood with her against impossible odds and won. "Are you hurt?" she asked softly, searching his face for signs of damage. "I don't think so." Garrett managed a weak smile that didn't quite hide the exhaustion. "Though I'm pretty sure I just used parts of my brain that were supposed to stay theoretical. I could feel the ship, could feel you, could feel everything." "It was overwhelming," Seraphine suggested. "Beautiful," he corrected. Terrifying and overwhelming, yes, but also beautiful in a way I don't have words for. She helped him sit up against the crystal pedestal, never letting go of his hand. Around them, the ship settled into the rhythms of warp travel, the crew returning to their stations with robes that had shifted from panic gray to odd gold. Rest now. She brushed hair back from his forehead with a tenderness that made something in his chest ache. Vioris Prime is 4 hours away. When we arrive, you'll be free. I promise you that. Garrett closed his eyes, exhausted beyond anything he'd ever experienced, his entire nervous system feeling like it had been rewired and reassembled slightly wrong. But beneath the exhaustion was something else, something that felt suspiciously like purpose. Thank you, he murmured, for seeing me as worth saving. Thank you for teaching me that I was worth saving too. He let sleep take him, then trusting in a way he'd never trusted anyone before. And in his dreams, he was still merged with the Shem and Seraphine and the infinite silence. But this time it didn't feel overwhelming. It felt like exactly what he was meant to be. The space where the noise ended and something new could begin. The jump through warp space felt like being unmade and remade in the same instant, reality becoming negotiable for 4 hours, while the luminous reach traversed distances that should have been impossible. When they dropped back into normal space, Garrett's first conscious view of Vioris Prime made every word he had ever known feel inadequate. The planet hung below them like a jewel carved from impossible light. Where Kepler 442 had been storms and violence, an endless churn of cobalt chaos, Vioris Prime was crystalline grace made manifest. Massive spires of what looked like white stone but moved like living things rose from mountain ranges, their peaks vanishing into clouds that glowed with soft bioluminescence even in daylight. Bridges of pure light visible even from orbit connected the structures in geometric patterns that seemed to shift as he watched. And the oceans, vast and ancient, shimmered with a turquoise so vivid it seemed more like liquid gemstone than water. The singing mountains, Seraphine whispered beside him, her voice carrying a complex mixture of relief and something that might have been sorrow. The wind through the crystal formations creates a constant harmony. For my people, it is our heartbeat, the rhythm we're born to, the song we die listening to. She didn't finish the thought, but Garrett understood. For her, even beauty was noise. Even home was a prison of connection. The landing at the Sovereign Spire drew thousands of Vesperi to the central plaza, their presence announced by a wave of color so intense it was visible from the descending ship. As Seraphine descended the ramp with Garrett following close behind, the crowd's robes erupted in cascading waves of silver and gold. Reverence and joy rippling through them like wind through wheat fields. But when Garrett stepped fully into the alien sunlight of twin stars, something remarkable happened. Silence spread outward from him like ripples on still water. The frantic shimmer of thousands of robes slowed, hummed, settled into steady blues and soft greens. Faces turned toward him, quicksilver eyes widening with expressions he couldn't read. Relief, wonder, fear without empathic feedback. He was blind to their emotions in ways they had never experienced blindness before. Counselor Varen stepped forward, his aged form radiating formal authority, despite the exhaustion that colored his robes a pale gray. His voice, when it came, wasn't sound, but vibration that Garrett felt in his chest like the memory of thunder. Citizens of the Seventh House, your sovereign has returned from the human territories, and with her she brings the one who stood between us and annihilation, the human of the void, the silence bearer. Garrett Voss, who proved that what we called emptiness can be strength, and what we feared as absence can be salvation. The crowd's response was a color shift Garrett was beginning to recognize as approval. Robes turning gold in synchronized waves that looked like a field of flowers opening to the sun. But standing in the center of that alien acclaim, surrounded by beauty he couldn't fully process, and gratitude he hadn't earned, Garrett felt more alone than he ever had in his cramped quarters on Meridian Station. The first 3 days on Vioris Prime were a blur of ceremonies and medical evaluations that Seraphine insisted were voluntary, but felt increasingly mandatory. The Vesperi healers studied him with instruments that looked like living crystal, mapping his neural patterns with a fascination that reminded him too much of Investigator Thorne's clinical assessment, just wrapped in more polite language. They installed him in a luxury suite in the upper spires, a space larger than any apartment he'd had on Earth. The walls were living art bioluminescent organisms that responded to proximity, by blooming into colors he didn't have names for. The furniture seemed to grow from the floor organic curves that were somehow more comfortable than anything manufactured. There was a bathing pool that purified itself through mechanisms he couldn't identify, and there was no coffee maker, synthetic or otherwise. Garrett spent the first night sitting by the window, looking out at the impossible beauty of the Crystal City, with its bridges of light and its singing mountains, and missing the familiar smell of machine oil and recycled air, with an intensity that felt like grief. On the second day, he attended his first formal meal with Seraphine and her inner circle of advisors. The Vesperi didn't eat the way humans did, a fact that became immediately and uncomfortably apparent. Their food was arranged in elaborate geometric patterns on crystalline plates, but consumption happened through empathic resonance. They would place their hands near the food and somehow absorb its essence, its emotional imprint, its memories of sunlight and growth and the soil it came from. It was intimate in a way that made human eating seem crude by comparison. Communal in a way that required the very sense Garrett lacked. He sat at the table while Seraphine and her counselors engaged in the ritual, feeling like a piece of broken equipment someone had accidentally left in the room. When a server, her robes flickering, uncertain yellow, offered him a plate of what looked like fruit, he picked up a piece with his fingers and bit into it. The entire table went silent. Not the comfortable silence Garrett carried with him, but the shocked silence of cultural violation. Apparently, physical consumption was considered primitive, childish. The sort of thing very young Vesperi did before they developed proper empathic control. Garrett set the fruit down and excused himself quietly, Seraphine's concerned gaze following him, but her duties keeping her seated. On the third day, he tried to attend a council session to understand the political structure of the world he now inhabited. Seraphine had insisted he was welcome, that understanding their governance would help him feel less isolated. But Vesperi communication happened primarily through ear movements, so subtle Garrett could barely track them. Color shifts in robes that carried nuanced meanings he couldn't interpret, and empathic undertones that transmitted entire conversations in the spaces between spoken words. He sat for 2 hours understanding perhaps one word in 10, increasingly aware that he was a stranger, in a society built on a sense he didn't possess. Like trying to appreciate music while deaf or art while blind, but somehow worse because everyone else could perceive what he couldn't, and his inability made him fundamentally incomplete in their eyes. That evening, he found Seraphine in the private gardens behind the Sovereign Spire, a space of controlled beauty, where bioluminescent flowers bloomed in darkness, and the air smelled like rain on ancient stone. She stood at a balcony overlooking the turquoise sea, her robes a melancholic purple in the light of the setting twin suns. She looked regal, composed. Everything a sovereign should be, back in her element, no longer the desperate woman who had broken into a stranger's quarters seeking silence. And Garrett realized he was about to break both their hearts. "I can't do this," he said quietly, the words feeling like stones in his throat. Seraphine turned, and for a moment her mask slipped. He saw exhaustion in her mirror-like eyes, the weight of returning to her responsibilities after tasting freedom. "Do what, Garrett? Live here. Be the human of the void, the silence bearer, whatever they want to call me." He ran a hand through his hair, the frustration finally breaking through the careful control he had been maintaining. "I'm an engineer, Seraphine. I fix broken machines. I don't attend ceremonies where I'm displayed like some kind of exotic artifact that proved useful once, but no one knows what to do with now." He gestured at the beautiful gardens, the crystal spires glowing in the distance, the alien perfection of everything around them. "I escaped one laboratory just to end up in a different kind of cage. A prettier one, sure, but still a cage. I can't eat your food without looking like a primitive. I can't understand your communication. I spent 2 hours in a council meeting, understanding nothing, aware that everyone knew. I understood nothing, and I couldn't tell if they pitied me or were annoyed by my presence. You're not a prisoner here." But even as she said it, uncertainty crept into her voice, her robes flickering through several colors before settling back on purple. "Aren't I?" Garrett's voice came out harder than he intended. "I can't go back to human space. Titan energy would arrest me the moment I set foot on any station or colony. So I'm here dependent on your protection, your hospitality, your charity. Living in luxury, I didn't earn, serving a purpose I never chose, being grateful for a salvation that's starting to feel like just a different flavor of imprisonment." He saw her flinch as though he'd struck her, her hands going to her chest, as if trying to hold something inside that was breaking. "I brought you here to save you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Did you?" The question came out harder than he intended, but he couldn't stop now. The words had been building for 3 days and they needed to be said. "Or did you bring me here because you need my silence, because I'm useful? Because I'm the only place where the noise stops and you can hear yourself think?" The words hung in the air between them like a blade. Seraphine's robes flickered through several colors rapidly, her empathic control slipping for the first time since they'd arrived. When she spoke again, her voice was raw with something that might have been pain or anger or both. "Is that what you truly think? That I see you as nothing more than a tool? That these nights we spent together, the stories, the connection we built, you think that was all just me using you?" "I don't know." Garrett's shoulders sagged, the fight draining out of him as quickly as it had come. "I don't know what I think anymore. All I know is that I don't belong here. I thought leaving Meridian would mean freedom, but I'm starting to realize I've just traded one kind of isolation for another. At least on the station, I knew what I was, the flatliner who fixed pipes. Here, I don't even know what I'm supposed to be." Seraphine's hand went to her chest again, pressing against her heart as if trying to physically hold together something that was shattering. "Then what do you want, Garrett? Do you want to go back to Earth? I can arrange passage to neutral territory, somewhere Titan energy doesn't have jurisdiction. You would be free to—" "I don't want to go back." The admission surprised him as much as it seemed to surprise her. "I can't go back. Even if Titan energy wasn't waiting to cage me, even if I could return to Meridian or Earth or Mars, I can't go back to being the person I was. The person who believed his silence was a curse, who spent 32 years thinking he was broken. You changed that, Seraphine. You made me believe I could be something more." He took a step closer, needing her to understand even as the words hurt them both. "But I can't stay here like this. Not as some kind of living silence generator that you visit when the noise gets too loud. Not as a curiosity that your people study and display and don't quite know what to do with. I need to be useful in a way that matters. I need work that uses my hands, not just my convenient neural defect. I need to be Garrett Voss engineer, not just the human of the void who stands around looking decorative while everyone whispers about how strange I am. That's not what you are to me." Seraphine's voice cracked, and he saw tears beginning to track down her luminous cheeks, catching the light like falling stars. But she stopped. And in that pause, Garrett saw the terrible truth written across her face. After 10 years of being a sovereign, of subordinating every personal feeling to the needs of the seventh house, she genuinely didn't know. She couldn't distinguish between what she felt for him as a person and what she felt for the relief he provided, between caring about him and needing what he could do for her. "Maybe you should figure that out," Garrett said quietly, each word feeling like pulling splinters from his own heart. "And maybe I need to figure out who I am when I'm not defined by what I can do for someone else. When I'm not Lyra's defective boyfriend or Thorne's tactical asset or your sanctuary from the noise. Just Garrett, whatever that means." He turned to leave and Seraphine didn't call him back. He heard her quiet sob behind him, but he kept walking, knowing that if he turned around, he would take it all back, and they would both pretend the problems didn't exist and nothing would ever change. The crisis came on the fourth day, announced by alarm tones that made the crystal walls vibrate with urgency. Garrett was in his suite, seriously considering the logistics of stealing a shuttle and trying to find some remote colony where he could disappear into anonymity when Counselor Mira appeared at his door. Her robes were a frantic orange and red colors that spoke of emergency and fear. "The Children's District," she said without preamble, her usual composure shattered. "Empathic Cascade, we need you, now." They ran through corridors that had become slightly more familiar over 3 days past Vesperia, whose robes shifted to worried yellows and frightened grays as they passed. The Children's District occupied the lower levels of the Sovereign Spire, a space designed for young Vesperi, who hadn't yet learned to fully control their empathic abilities. When Garrett arrived, it looked like a war zone. 50 children ranging from what looked like 5 to 15 years old in human terms writhed on the floor in synchronized agony. Their robes flickered through every color in rapid succession, like broken displays, their small hands clutching at their heads in a gesture of pain that transcended species. Several were bleeding from their noses, the silver-tinged blood looking almost luminescent against their translucent skin. Adult Vesperi stood around them in a ring of helplessness, their attempts to calm the children only feeding the feedback loop, their empathic presence amplifying the psychic storm instead of dampening it. And in the center of it all, trying desperately to reach a young male child whose robes had gone completely black with overload, was Seraphine. "Sovereign, step back!" Varen shouted from the perimeter, his aged voice carrying more emotion than Garrett had ever heard from him. "You're too powerful. Your empathic field is making it worse." But Seraphine either couldn't hear or wouldn't listen. She reached for the child, and Garrett watched her own robes start to flicker with distress as the cascade threatened to pull her under, to drag her down into the same drowning that was destroying the young minds around her. Mara grabbed Garrett's arm with surprising strength, her fingers digging in with desperate intensity. "Please, create your silence. It's the only thing that can break the loop. These children will die if we don't interrupt the resonance." Garrett looked at the suffering children, their small bodies convulsing with empathic overload. At Seraphine, desperate in failing her sovereign training, useless against this kind of raw psychic storm. At the adult Vesperi, who had built an entire civilization on empathy and were now being destroyed by it, helpless to save their own young. He thought about what Seraphine had said in their argument. About being useful. About being more than just a neural anomaly to be deployed when convenient. He thought about the conversation they'd had in the gardens, about her inability to separate what she felt for him from what she needed from him. "No," he said. Every Vesperi in the room turned to stare at him with expressions of shock and betrayal so profound they needed no empathic translation. "What?" Mira's voice was barely audible, strangled with disbelief. "No," Garrett repeated louder, this time his voice carrying across the space despite the sounds of suffering. "This is your world. Your people, your children. You need to solve this yourselves, because if I am your solution every time something goes wrong, you'll never learn. You'll just become dependent on me the same way." He stopped himself, but the implication hung in the air. The same way Seraphine was becoming dependent on him. "They're dying," Varen shouted, his control finally breaking completely. "Children are dying in front of us, and you're making philosophical points about self-reliance." "I'm making a necessary point." Garrett looked directly at Seraphine across the chaos. Her mirror-like eyes met his, wide with pain and confusion and the first glimmers of understanding. "You have everything you need to save them. You just have to remember how to use it. You have to remember what I taught you." For a moment, Seraphine looked like she might collapse under the weight of what he was asking. Her robes cycled through colors so rapidly they became a blur. The child she'd been trying to reach convulsed harder, blood now flowing freely from his nose. Then something shifted in her expression. Something hard and determined, and finally her own. Not the sovereign mask she wore for others, not the desperate woman who had broken into his quarters seeking salvation, but Seraphine herself, whole and complete and ready to stand on her own strength. She stepped back from the children, closed her eyes, and started to speak. Not with her voice, with her mind projecting outward in a way Garrett couldn't hear but could see the effect of. Seraphine's robe settled into a steady deep blue, the color of calm, of control of water, deep enough to drown in or learn to swim. And she began to tell them a story. Garrett couldn't hear the narrative she was weaving into their minds, but he could see it working. The children's frantic writhing began to slow. Their color shifts started to synchronize, following the rhythm of whatever tale Seraphine was spinning into their consciousness. She was using her empathic abilities not to absorb their pain, not to try to calm them through sheer force of will, but to give them something to hold on to. A structure, a framework, a way to separate their own emotions from the overwhelming collective storm. The story of the last lighthouse at Galaxy's Edge. Seraphine wove the narrative Garrett had told her on their third night together into the children's minds with careful precision. Not forcing, just offering. An image of a lone figure in the dark maintaining a light that said, "You are not lost. You have a center. You have yourself." The lighthouse keeper who learned to be alone without being lonely. Who discovered that solitude and isolation weren't the same thing. Who found strength in creating boundaries and knowing where she ended and the universe began. The children grasped onto the story like drowning swimmers finding a rope. They followed the lighthouse keeper's journey through Seraphine's careful empathic guidance, learning, through narrative what their young minds couldn't yet understand conceptually, that you could acknowledge the vast ocean of other minds without being swept away by it, that you could be both connected and whole, that boundaries weren't walls that separated you from others. They were foundations that let you stand strong enough to truly connect. One by one, the children's robes settled. The frantic colors calmed to steady greens and soft blues. The convulsions ceased. The bleeding stopped. The young male child at the center, the one whose robes had gone completely black with overload, opened his quicksilver eyes and looked at Seraphine with an expression of wonder that transcended the need for words. I could hear myself, he vibrated softly, his voice weak but clear. In the story and the quiet spaces of the lighthouse keeper's mind, I found where I ended and everyone else began. That is the gift, Seraphine said gently, kneeling beside him, but maintaining careful distance, no longer trying to absorb his pain, but helping him hold his own. Not isolation, not disconnection, just knowing where your shore is. Understanding that you can swim in the ocean without being drowned by it. She stood slowly, her own robes now a triumphant gold that seemed to glow with inner light, and turned to face Garrett across the room full of recovering children. Their eyes met, and she smiled at him with gratitude and something deeper. Understanding, acknowledgement that he had given her exactly what she needed by refusing to give her what she wanted. Thank you, she mouthed silently. Garrett nodded once and left the room, his heart simultaneously breaking and healing in the same moment. They met again in the gardens as the twin suns set painting the sky in shades of amber and violet that reminded Garrett of the storms on Kepler 442, of the viewport in his cramped quarters, where this had all begun. You were right, Seraphine said, settling onto a bench made of living wood that seemed to grow specifically to accommodate her. I was using you, not intentionally, perhaps not even consciously, but using you nonetheless. And I was using you, Garrett admitted, sitting beside her, but maintaining space between them, the gap feeling both necessary and painful. As validation, proof that I wasn't empty, that I had value. But that's not fair to either of us. We both deserve better than being tools for each other's healing. But you do have value, Garrett. Her robe shifted through several shades of blue emotions she was learning to control but not suppress. Not because of what you can do for me, because of who you are. I know now. He looked down at his hands, at the calluses and scars from years of honest labor, physical evidence of a life spent fixing broken things. But not because of what I can do for you, because I'm learning to see it in myself. And you have value too, not as a vessel for the seventh house, as Seraphine. Her robes cascaded through several colors before settling on a soft, genuine gold. What you did today, refusing to help when every instinct must have screamed at you to intervene. It was the cruelest kindness anyone has ever shown me. You needed to know you could stand alone, that you didn't need me to be whole. I did. She finally looked at him, and in her luminous stare he saw something he'd never seen before. Not desperate need, not grateful dependence, not even romantic longing, though that was there too. Just genuine affection for who he was, separate from what he could provide. The children, I used what you taught me. Not your silence, but the stories. The way narrative can create boundaries in consciousness, can give a mind structure to hold on to when everything else is chaos. So you turned it into a teaching method. I turned it into survival. She reached out, and this time when she took his hand, it felt different, equal. Garrett, I want to build something here, something that matters. Sanctuary schools, places where Vastberry can learn what you taught me. Not to rely on your silence, but to find their own. Using narrative meditation to create internal boundaries. To remember that we are individuals, not just nodes in a collective consciousness. Garrett felt something warm spreading through his chest, chasing away some of the cold loneliness that had settled there over the past 3 days. That's ambitious. It's necessary, and I can't do it alone, but... She paused, and her grip on his hand tightened slightly. I'm not asking you to be my crutch. I'm not asking you to solve every crisis with your neural silence. I'm asking you to be my partner, my friend, my collaborator in building something new. She took a breath, and when she spoke again, her voice was stronger, more certain. To help design these schools, not because I need your silence, but because you understand what it means to be alone in a crowd. Because you can teach others to find the quiet that I'm learning to find myself. Because your experience with isolation, with creating boundaries, with being whole, even when you're disconnected, that has value beyond just dampening empathic noise. And if I want to leave someday, the question hurt them both, but it needed to be asked. Seraphine didn't flinch. Then you leave. You're not my prisoner, Garrett Voss. You're not my tool or my salvation or my property. You're someone I care about because of who you are, not what you provide. And if staying here makes you miserable, then all the peace in the universe isn't worth your unhappiness. Garrett looked out at the turquoise sea, at the crystal spires glowing in the deepening twilight, at the alien beauty of a world that was slowly, painfully becoming less foreign. I don't want to leave, not yet anyway, but I need a purpose, real work, not ceremonies and medical studies and being displayed like an interesting artifact. I need to fix things. Seraphine's smile was radiant, her robes blooming into the brightest gold he'd seen from her. Then I have a proposition. Our water purification system has been failing for 3 decades. Our engineers try to feel what's wrong with it, to empathically sense the machinery's distress, but it doesn't work. Machines don't have emotions to read. They just break according to physics and time. We need someone who understands that sometimes the solution isn't to listen harder, it's to turn the damn screw. For the first time in days, Garrett laughed. A real laugh from deep in his chest, surprising them both. I think I can handle that. They sat together in the comfortable silence as darkness fell completely and the bioluminescent flowers began to glow around them. Eventually, Seraphine leaned her head on his shoulder and Garrett carefully put his arm around her, and it felt different from before. Not desperate or dependent, but chosen. A conscious decision to be close because they wanted to be, not because they needed to be. 6 months, Seraphine murmured. Give me 6 months to build the first sanctuary school, to prove that the method works, that Vesperi can learn internal boundaries, to show my people that I'm not abandoning our culture, just expanding it to include something we never knew we needed. And if it doesn't work, then we try something else. Together, if you're willing, part that you need to be. But at least we'll know we tried to build something better instead of just clinging to each other's weaknesses. Garrett looked up at the alien stars beginning to emerge in the darkening sky, constellations he didn't recognize, made of suns he'd never learned the names for. 6 months, he agreed. Let's see what we can build. 6 months later. The morning sun, the first of the twin stars to rise, painted the turquoise sea in shades of gold and copper that reminded Garrett of Earth's Pacific Ocean of mornings on Montana cliffs, watching waves that had traveled impossible distances just to break against stone. He stood on his balcony, drinking coffee that still tasted terrible, but was his terrible coffee made from a machine he'd cobbled together from Vesperi filtration components and sheer stubborn engineering. The apartment was in the mid-spires now, a choice he'd made after realizing the luxury suite felt like living in a museum. Here, surrounded by working-class Vesperi and the constant hum of the city's infrastructure, he felt almost at home. The past 6 months had transformed him in ways he was still discovering. The first month had been adjustment, learning to navigate Vesperi social customs without empathy, discovering which engineering tools translated across species and which didn't, figuring out that his terrible coffee was actually appreciated by a subset of younger Vesperi who found it authentically primitive and therefore fascinating. He'd made mistakes, caused offense without meaning to, struggled with the isolation of being the only human on an entire planet, but he'd also started to build something. The second month brought his first major project, the water purification system Seraphine had mentioned. 3 weeks elbow deep in crystalline filtration arrays that had been empathically diagnosed for decades without success because, as Garrett had explained to bemused Vesperi engineers, machines don't have feelings, and trying to sense their emotional state was about as useful as trying to smell mathematics. The moment he got it running, delivering clean water to 50,000 residents of the lower districts using nothing more than replacement parts he'd machined himself and basic maintenance protocols, he'd felt more accomplished than any ceremony could make him. By the third month, young Vesperi started seeking him out, not for his silence exactly, but for his perspective. They'd ask about Earth engineering, about solving problems through logic instead of feeling about what it meant to exist without empathy. He became an accidental teacher, holding informal workshops in the engineering bays where he worked, showing them that there were multiple ways to understand the universe, and none of them were inherently superior. The fourth month brought the first sanctuary school, opening a small facility in the lower districts where Seraphine taught narrative meditation to classes of young Vesperi. Garrett had helped design the curriculum, sharing the stories he knew, and working with Vesperi educators to adapt them into teaching tools. Watching Seraphine teach children to discover their own boundaries through story, seeing them learn to hold thoughts that were only their own without losing their empathic abilities, had made something in his chest swell with pride that had nothing to do with romance and everything to do with witnessing someone become who they were meant to be. The fifth month brought expansion. 3 more schools. Training programs for Vesperi educators who wanted to teach the method. Resistance from traditionalists who saw internal boundaries as a rejection of Vesperi culture, but growing support from families whose children were finally learning to exist without being overwhelmed by collective consciousness. Garrett had found himself consulting on school design thermal systems, acoustic properties of crystal that might enhance or diminish empathic resonance. Real work, valuable work. Work that used his hands and his mind and his experience with isolation in ways that helped others without requiring him to be anything other than himself. By month 6, Garrett realized he'd stopped counting the days until he could leave and started counting the projects he wanted to complete before year's end. He finished his coffee and headed out into the Neon District, the marketplace where young Vesperi gathered to trade light-weaving art and ideas and arguments about whether traditions should be preserved or evolved. The empathic noise here was different from human crowds. More harmonious in some ways, more overwhelming in others. But Garrett had learned to navigate it, to use his presence strategically, rather than feeling like his existence was an imposition. He saw the young Vesperi male before anyone else noticed the crisis developing. Kale, barely 20 years old by Vesperi reckoning, collapsed on a bench with his robes flickering through frantic red patterns that spoke of resonant seizure. His mind was drowning in the collective excitement of the crowd around him, unable to separate his own emotions from the amplified feedback loop of hundreds of young minds, all broadcasting their enthusiasm at maximum volume. 6 months ago, Garrett would have hesitated, worried about overstepping, questioned whether it was his place to intervene, whether his help would create dependency, whether he was solving a problem that needed to be solved differently. Now he simply walked over and sat down beside the young Vesperi without fanfare. He didn't say anything, didn't make a production of it, just placed his hand on Kale's shoulder and opened the doors of his mind, becoming the silence that he'd finally learned to accept as strength rather than weakness. The effect was immediate. The red flickering slowed, settled, transformed into a steady violet of recovery. Kale took a shuddering breath and opened his quicksilver eyes, meeting Garrett's storm-gray gaze with profound recognition and gratitude. "Thank you," the young Vesperi vibrated, his voice weak but sincere. "Drink some water," Garrett said quietly, pulling a container from his toolkit and handing it over. "And maybe find a quieter place for a while. The marketplace will still be here when you are stronger. You don't have to prove you can handle the noise if you're not ready yet." He stood to leave and realized the crowd around them had gone silent. Not the empathic silence he created, but the silence of respect. 50 Vesperi robes turned soft gold, acknowledging him not as an alien curiosity or a useful anomaly, but as one of their own. Someone who had earned his place through service and presence and the simple act of being consistently helpful without asking for anything in return. Garrett nodded to them and walked on, feeling something warm in his chest that might have been belonging. That evening, he found Seraphine in her private chambers reviewing reports on the sanctuary school program with an expression of focused concentration he'd come to recognize as her planning face, the face she wore when she was building something that mattered. "The council approved the expansion," she said without looking up from her crystalline tablet, her robes a contented blue that spoke of satisfaction and purpose. 3 new worlds, 12 more schools. They want to call it the Voss methodology. Absolutely not. That got her attention. She looked up, and Garrett saw the woman she had become over 6 months of transformation. Still sovereign, still carrying the weight of the 7th house, but no longer crushed by it, no longer disappearing into her duties. She had learned to create boundaries within her empathic abilities, to be a leader without being consumed by leadership, to serve her people without sacrificing herself on the altar of their needs. They insist, she said with a smile that was part amused, part affectionate, part proud of his reflexive humility. You're becoming famous, Garrett, the human who taught the Vespri to be quiet. I didn't teach them to be quiet, you did that. You took what I showed you and turned it into something bigger than either of us could have created alone. He crossed to where she sat and settled into the chair across from her, the one that had become his by unspoken agreement over months of evening conversations. I just told you some stories and provided a convenient silence. You're the one who transformed that into an educational philosophy. Seraphine set down the tablet and moved to where he stood by the window, and they had fallen into a comfortable routine over the past months. Evenings together, sometimes talking about their work, sometimes sharing stories from their respective cultures, sometimes just existing in companionable silence. The romantic elements were there, undeniable and growing stronger, but they had learned to let them develop naturally instead of forcing them out of desperation or need. I saw you in the Neon District today, she said, settling beside him, with young Kael. He was having a rough moment. You didn't hesitate. 6 months ago, you would have walked away, would have questioned whether helping was the right thing to do, whether it would create dependency, whether your presence was wanted or just tolerated. 6 months ago, I was still figuring out if this was home. And now, Garrett looked out at the crystal spires, at the turquoise sea, catching the light of the setting suns, at the alien constellations beginning to emerge in the darkening sky. Now I'm figuring out how to make it home. It's different. It's still strange in ways I don't think will ever feel normal. But different isn't always bad. Sometimes different is just different. A new kind of normal that you build for yourself instead of having it built for you. Seraphine moved closer, and he felt the now familiar warmth of her presence. Not the desperate, drowning woman who had broken into his quarters, but a partner. A friend. Someone who had grown alongside him, who had learned her own strength while helping him discover his. I received a message today from your sister, Sarah, on Mars Colony. Garrett's head snapped around, his heart suddenly racing. How I thought, I've been working with the Terran Diplomatic Corps, establishing proper channels of communication between the Seventh House and human space, negotiating treaties that recognize your status as a voluntary guest rather than stolen property. It's been delicate work, but the broadcast pulse incident and Titan Energy's aggressive pursuit have actually worked in our favor. Other human corporations are nervous about the precedent, and they're putting pressure on Titan to back down. She handed him a data tablet with an expression of gentle satisfaction. Sarah doesn't know exactly where you are. Operational security requires some discretion, but she knows you're safe. She says to tell you that your nephew asks about Uncle Garrett every day, that your work is making waves in xenocultural circles, and that she's glad you found what you were looking for, even if it's 600 light years from home. Something tight in Garrett's chest loosened slightly, a tension he hadn't fully acknowledged until it began to release. I should write back. I thought you might want to. Seraphine's smile was warm with understanding. The quantum relay is ready when you are, and there's no rush. Take the time you need to find the right words. They stood together in the comfortable silence, watching the twin moons rise over an alien sea, painting everything in shades of silver and blue. After a while, Seraphine spoke again, her voice soft with something that might have been wonder. Do you remember that first night when I broke into your quarters because I was desperate for any moment of peace? Hard to forget waking up to find a sovereign sleeping on my chest. I thought you were my salvation, the answer to a problem I didn't know how to solve, a cure for an illness I couldn't escape. She turned to face him fully, her luminous stare holding his with the kind of honesty that had taken 6 months to build. I was wrong. You weren't the answer. You were the teacher. You showed me that the answer was inside me all along. I just needed the space to find it, the stories to give it structure, the example of someone who had learned to be whole even in isolation. And now I can carry the weight of the seventh house without being crushed by it, because I know how to find my own silence when the noise becomes too much. Because I remember what Seraphine feels like, separate from the sovereign, an individual with her own thoughts and dreams and boundaries. She reached up and touched his cheek, the gesture now familiar and precious. You gave me that, Not through your neural silence, but through your stubborn insistence that I could stand on my own. Through your stories that taught me how to create internal boundaries. Through refusing to be my crutch when I needed to learn to walk. You gave me something too, Garrett said quietly, his own hand coming up to cover hers. You made me believe that being empty wasn't the same as being broken. That the quiet in my head could be valuable instead of a flaw. That 32 years of isolation had actually taught me something worth sharing with others. You were never empty, Garrett. You were a harbor, a sanctuary, the space between the noise where souls could finally breathe without drowning. They stood like that for a long moment, two people from impossibly different worlds who had somehow found each other in the dark and built something neither could have created alone. 3 weeks later, the Seventh House Assembly Hall filled with thousands of Vesperi, their robes creating a living tapestry of color and movement that looked like a sea of flowers responding to invisible wind. Garrett watched from the side gallery, no longer uncomfortable with being observed, just another part of the community now. Beside him, Counselor Varen had become something approaching a friend. Over the past months, their initial antagonism transformed into mutual respect through the simple process of working together toward a common goal. She's changed. The old Vesperi noted his robes a contemplative blue that spoke of reflection rather than anxiety. In 10 years of sovereignty, I have never seen her like this. Powerful but not overwhelmed. Connected but not consumed. She carries the weight, but it no longer crushes her. She learned to find her boundaries, Garrett said, watching as Seraphine took her place at the central podium with the confident grace of someone who had finally become comfortable in her own skin. You taught her. I showed her the door. She walked through it herself. That's the only kind of teaching that actually works, giving people the tools to discover their own strength, not solving their problems for them. Seraphine began to speak, and the assembly hall fell into attentive silence that rippled outward from her presence. Her voice, amplified by empathic projection that Garrett could sense even without being able to experience it, directly reached every mind present. Citizens of the Seventh House, for 10 years I have served as your sovereign. For 10 years I have carried your joys and your sorrows, your hopes and your fears. I have been the vessel as our traditions demand and as our culture has required for 10,000 years of history. Her robes shifted through colors as she spoke, painting her emotions for all to see: honesty in blue, strength in gold, vulnerability in purple, flowing together in patterns that told their own story. But I have learned something in these past months, something that will transform how we understand ourselves as a people, how we relate to each other, how we balance our gift of empathy with our need for individual identity. I learned it from an unlikely teacher, a human engineer who came to us not seeking power or glory or even understanding, but simply seeking freedom from those who would make him a prisoner of his own uniqueness, who would reduce him to nothing more than a useful biological anomaly to be exploited. Garrett felt thousands of quicksilver eyes turn toward him briefly before returning to their sovereign, the attention no longer uncomfortable but simply acknowledged. This human Garrett Voss taught me that silence is not the absence of life. It is a form of life. That boundaries are not walls that separate us from each other, but foundations that allow us to stand strong enough to truly connect. That being whole as individuals doesn't diminish our ability to join together, it enhances it because we bring our complete selves to the collective rather than disappearing into it. Seraphine's robes settled into a brilliant, defiant gold that seemed to illuminate the entire hall. And most importantly, he taught me that stories, simple narratives held in the quiet of our own minds, can give us the space to remember who we are beneath the noise of collective consciousness. That we can use narrative to create internal boundaries to hold thoughts that are only our own without severing our empathic connections to each other. I am announcing today the expansion of the Sanctuary School program to every Vesperi world in the Seventh House, with plans to share the methodology with the other houses if they wish to adopt it. We will teach our children not to abandon empathy, which is the core of what makes us Vesperi, but to balance it with internal silence. We will learn to hold thoughts that are only our own, to find the space between connection where the individual soul can breathe. The assembly erupted in color robes, shifting through patterns of approval and wonder and cautious hope, a symphony of emotion that needed no words to express its magnitude. This is not a rejection of who we are, Seraphine continued, her voice carrying the weight of absolute conviction. It is a completion of who we are. We are empathic beings. We are connected. We are collective, but we are also individuals. We are also whole. And it is time we learn to be both, to hold both truths simultaneously without sacrificing one for the other. She paused, and when she spoke again, her voice carried a depth of emotion that made even Garrett's eyes sting with sympathetic tears. I spent 10 years believing that being a sovereign meant disappearing into my duty, that I had to sacrifice myself completely to serve my people, that there was no room for Seraphine inside the vessel of the seventh house. But I have learned that a sovereign who has lost herself cannot truly lead, that the greatest service I can provide is to be whole, to be strong, to be Seraphine and the sovereign, not one at the expense of the other. The hall had gone absolutely still, every being present hanging on her words with an attention that transcended even their empathic connection. In the silence between the stars, I found my voice. In the space between the noise, I remembered who I was. And now I invite all of you to find yours as well. Not to separate from each other, but to bring your whole selves to the collective. To be strong individuals within a connected whole. To prove that empathy and identity can coexist, that we can be both profoundly connected and profoundly ourselves. The celebration lasted for hours, but eventually Garrett found himself alone in his apartment, sitting on his balcony, with his terrible coffee and the peace of a day well lived, watching the bioluminescent flowers bloom in the darkness. He pulled out the data tablet and began composing his message to Sarah, the words coming easier than he'd expected. Sister, by the time you receive this, I'll have been on Vioris Prime for 6 months. 6 months that feel like 6 years in terms of how much has changed, how far I've come from the man who fixed atmospheric scrubbers in the rust gut and believed his silence was a curse. I know you must have questions, probably some anger at my sudden disappearance. Maybe a lot of fear about what happened, about whether I'm safe, whether I'm being held against my will, whether I've made a terrible mistake. I'm safe, better than safe. I'm home in a way I never was on Meridian or Earth or anywhere else in the human systems. Remember how Mom used to worry about me, how she'd say I was too quiet, too isolated, that I'd never find where I belonged because I couldn't connect the way normal people did. Turns out I just needed to look outside our entire civilization to find a place where my particular kind of broken was exactly what someone needed. I work with machinery here, fixing systems that have been malfunctioning for longer than human beings have had spaceflight. I live in a city made of crystal and light, where the mountains sing and the oceans glow, and the stars are completely wrong, but somehow starting to feel right. I drink coffee that would make station recyclers taste like fine wine by comparison, but it's my coffee made with my own hands, and that makes it perfect. I've made friends, real friends. A queen who learned to stand alone without losing her connection to her people. Counselors who've stopped seeing me as a curiosity and started seeing me as a colleague. Children who've learned to find silence in a culture built on constant connection and who look at me like I'm a teacher instead of a defect. The work I'm doing here matters, Sarah. I'm helping build schools that teach empathic beings how to create internal boundaries, how to be individuals without losing their ability to connect. I'm using everything I learned from 32 years of isolation, all that loneliness, all that pain, all those years of thinking I was broken, and turning it into something that helps others. That gives value to experiences I thought were just wasted time. I don't know if I'll ever come back to Earth. Probably not. Titan Energy still considers me stolen property, and I have zero desire to spend the rest of my life in a laboratory being studied like a useful virus. But I'm not running away anymore, Sarah. For the first time in my life, I'm running towards something. Toward purpose. Toward belonging. Toward the understanding that what I always thought was my greatest flaw was actually my most valuable gift, just waiting for the right context to become useful. Tell your kids about their uncle. Tell them he went looking for silence in a universe of noise and found an entire civilization that needed to learn how to be quiet. Tell them that sometimes the parts of us that don't fit the pieces that seem broken or wrong or defective are exactly the parts the universe has been waiting for. That there's no such thing as being fundamentally flawed. There's only being in the wrong place. And once you find the right place, everything that seemed broken suddenly becomes essential. I'll write again soon. And maybe someday when the politics between humans and Vesperi settle into something more stable. you can visit. I think you'd like it here. The coffee's terrible, but the company is good and the sunsets are unlike anything you've ever seen. Your brother Garrett P.S., the nephew who asks about me every day. Tell him Uncle Garrett learned to fix stars. He'll understand when he's older. He sent the message and set down the tablet, feeling something settle in his chest. Not closure exactly, but connection. A bridge between the life he'd left behind and the life he was building. A glowing Vesperi butterfly, one of the native species that inhabited the crystal gardens and seemed to be attracted to sources of calm, landed on the rim of his coffee mug. Its wings pulsed with slow emerald light in the darkness, a heartbeat made visible. Garrett didn't move. Just watched the delicate creature, so alien and yet somehow familiar in its simple existence, in its contentment with being exactly what it was without apology or explanation. 32 years ago, a child had been born with a neural defect that made him unable to connect the way his species expected. That child had grown into a man who believed he was empty, broken, unworthy of love or belonging or any of the things that made life worth living. That man had traveled 600 light years and discovered that his emptiness was actually fullness of a different kind, that his silence was a voice that spoke in frequencies others couldn't produce, that the void he carried had always been exactly what the universe needed him to be. He'd just been in the wrong part of the universe to be useful. Garrett leaned back in his chair, closed his eyes, and listened to the singing mountains in the distance, their crystalline harmonics creating melodies that were slowly becoming as familiar as his own heartbeat. For 32 years, he had fought against his nature, trying to force himself into a shape that would never fit, apologizing for taking up space, believing that being different meant being lesser. Now finally, he could simply exist within it, could be exactly who he was without shame or apology, could offer his silence to a universe that desperately needed quiet spaces, and know that this offering had value not despite his nature, but because of it. The universe was still poorly maintained hardware as he'd always known. Still vast, still prone to catastrophic failure, still held together by the cosmic equivalent of duct tape and stubborn hope. But Garrett didn't mind the leaks anymore. He was an engineer, and he had found a whole new world of things to fix. In the space between the stars, in the silence between heartbeats, in the quiet that existed beneath all the noise of existence, Garrett Voss had finally found where he belonged. Not despite his emptiness, but because of it. And that realization, sitting on an alien balcony, drinking terrible coffee, while a bioluminescent butterfly kept him company, was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.